So most welcome for this policy roundtable that is dedicated to the US midterm election, what to expect. Welcome to our speakers, welcome to our online audience. My name is Etienne Basso. I'm the Director of the Members Research Service at EPRS and also currently Acting Director General. This policy roundtable comes at a very timely moment. We have the elections in about 2 weeks' time, I think. And it's also a sort of American week in the European Parliament, as we had yesterday. Jeff Nussbaum, who is the former speechwriter of President Joe Biden, that took us through his book yesterday. There was an extremely interesting discussion. And we have also a visiting delegation from both US and Senate, including the clerk and the parliamentarian, and they are visiting the Parliament, the EU institutions, the Monnet House also this week, and French institutions in Paris, the Senate and the National Assembly. So it's a very American week, if you like. And today we have 1.5 hours for this event, so presentations by speakers, and then we'll have time for question and answers, discussion. So most welcome again to our speakers. They will be introduced by Elena Lazaro, who is the head of the External Policies Unit and is going to moderate this discussion. But before that, we have the privilege to have with us Petra Kumpula-Natri. She's Vice Chair of the delegation of the European Parliament for relations with the United States. So that's the Congress is very important in this relation, but it's also relation to the executive, to the government. Petra Kumpula-Natri has been member of the European Parliament since 2014 for the group S&D. She's the first vice chair, as I said, for this delegation. She's also member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, where she focuses on energy and digital policies in particular. And she was actually running from a meeting with the commissioner in charge to join us for this conversation. Through her role as a substitute member of the Committee on International Trade, INTA, she's also the standing rapporteur of the Parliamentary Monitoring Group on e-commerce and a member of the USA Monitoring Group on Trade, so a very important issue in the transatlantic relation. She's also a strong advocate for gender equality and women in tech and digital cooperation. She's chair and founder of the UN Generation Equality Friendship Group in the European Parliament and a member of the EP's delegation to the Conference of the Future of Europe. And previously, she was member of the Eduskunta, the Finnish parliament for 11 years and chaired the Grand Committee responsible for EU-Finland relations at the parliamentary level. She's also been member of her hometown local council in Vasa for 20 years. So, Pietra, we are very happy to have you with us today, and we welcome you, and we are looking forward to your introduction. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for all the panel and participants. I think my list is very short compared to the speeches that we will have very soon. So it's an honor to be here to welcoming you and then having an insight for the very important midterm elections. I pass on the greetings from my chair, Sikorski, he's from Poland, and then the second vice chair for the US delegation is Stefanuta from Romania. We represent 3 different political parties as well, but all ambitious to having the good relations cross-Atlantic. And let me start, this is, I don't know, by accident, but the situation is that we happen to all be 3 neighboring countries for a big country nearby called Russia. And at some stage, when I started on this position, there was a worry that if USA will forget Russia and concentrate only on Asia and China. So I thank for Biden administration that this is not the case. Maybe some black rumor thanks to Putin's as well. So this region of the world remains on the focus also of the USA, and this is maybe the number 1. How would the possible changes in the powers reflect and be seen on the geopolitical tensions that we do have at this moment? And it's not only tensions, it is really a war on our continent. And the latest call from Putin, he says war against West. So coming to the skin as from a Finnish MEP, former member of Finnish Parliament, regarding the NATO questions, the politics inside the NATO are even more concerned for me personally and my country. whereas the EU response has been coordinated a lot with the USA, with several other countries. And I always want to say that we are for the democracies, and we remain to be on the side of the Ukraine when it defends its democratic international law to be untouched territory and sovereign state. And I'm so happy that so many UN General Assembly members also are in favor of that one. So this is where everybody and everything comes from. Also, when we observe the becoming midterm elections from this side of the Atlantic, that's always number one on this stage. But then when following news from this side Atlantic, one of the first things you see is the deep political divide across the modern America. And then we see that when what is the mood and changes, we saw at some point that in the run-up for these elections, the manifestation of the extreme social conservatism was able to mobilize the defenders of the liberal values, equality and women's rights. But then let's see how that will develop, because now it might be likely that the inflation and fuel prices since then have taken over the abortion as the top political issue in the minds of the many voters. So these are also that sensitivities that we try to understand, and how the country will be then run in the possible way if the Republicans succeed to take out and wipe out the Democratic majority in both House and Senate. So, of course, this side from Atlantic, we also very curious of the sentence that are we like-minded countries, and underline that democratic institutions need to have a democratic vote. So the biggest hope maybe is that these elections could be better than the last elections of the president, so that the people would trust, and that there is a respect of the democracy, also the way the votes are delivered, and then the people could to have that. We have seen bad figures, but I'm always optimistic. Then very concrete way, also I'm working in the INTA committee, which is here for the trade. It is also to be seen that how much that we find each other. The rivalry or competitive or partner China, there we find a language which is more suitable for EU, what is suitable for America. But then if we don't find each other on the trade and technology and other issues, it's not that easy to also see that there are rivalries that are authoritarian, and then that we work for the democracies. And then some last moment legislative files are not easy for Europe if it's America only kind of legislation for the future cleaner society, like the IRA Act has been. So there are tensions with all the administration, with all the parties, and that's why we need democracy, and then we need the cooperation. And I'm happy to continue the dialogue with any kind of colleagues from across Atlantics, as we see that there are a lot of commons, and when there is more challenge, the more tense connections are needed. So that's why we are here for 1.5 more years, almost 2 years for this European Parliament, and let's see with whom we will work after the elections. I'm very happy to thanking also the EPRS organizing this one and having such a good panel. Welcome on my behalf.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kumpula-Natri, also for setting the scene so effectively, and for the nice words about the organization. So without further ado, I will hand over to Elena to introduce our speakers. Several of them are quite close to the EPRS, as they have been participating to a lot of events. So I just like to flag on my side this publication, always a bit of publicity. The link will be shared in the chat very soon. It's about the midterm election. As you can imagine, where legislation meets politics, and it has been authored by our colleague Gisela Grieger, so make good use of it. It's really a very good sort of presentation of what is at stake there, so it's being shared now in the chat. Over to you, Elena, to introduce our speakers and to lead the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Good afternoon from me too, and good morning to those in the US. Good afternoon to our 100 WebEx attendees and everyone who is watching on live stream. It's really a pleasure to host you here today online. It's 2 weeks to the midterms, more or less. We're looking at the midterms with great interest for all the reasons that Mrs. Kumpula-Natri outlined, but also because in many ways the situation of Russia's war on Ukraine and the cooperation between the US and the EU on sanctions, on weapons deliveries, on a number of initiatives, I think makes us think of the US on a daily basis, even more than before. So really, all eyes are on the United States. And all eyes are on the midterms, I think even more so than in the past, because if anything, if we think of the last midterms, an unprecedented increase in voters across all categories, ages, and demographics, I think it really put midterms on the radar globally. So these midterms now come with that precedent. And I think the feeling that a lot is at stake, but also what it will look like in case we have that the House flips or that any of a divided government, that's all on the radar now much more than before. I think because partly of the 2018 election. And I'm very pleased to have our 4 speakers, in addition to Mrs. Kumpula-Natri, with us today. I really do consider, as Etienne said, all 4 of you EPRS partners. I think I was going back to remember, I think we discussed, if not the midterms, definitely the previous presidential election with a number of you in a similar event. So it does feel like we have a sense of continuity here. I wanted to, before I introduce our 4 speakers, also take my turn to thank my colleague Gisela Grieger, who authored the publication, but also helped organize this event, but also all the services across the House who has promoted the event, the Delegation for Relations for United States and the Secretariat, our office in DC. I think there is so much interest in so many components of the European Parliament who are working on transatlantic relations that really shows how much relevance there is at the moment of the transatlantic relationship, but also of parliamentary cooperation with the United States Congress. So on that note, I wanted to introduce our panel today. We have Bruce Stokes, who's a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Sarah Patton, who is vice president and national political director of the Progressive Policy Institute, Mark Strand, president of the Congressional Institute and former chief of staff to U.S. Senator Jim Talent, and Leslie Benjamouri, director, U.S. and America's program, Chatham House, with which I have a special relationship, so I'm very happy that they're joining us today. I won't go into the details of the bios because they've been shared with our audience, and I want to have time for questions later on. But I do want to say that our speakers today will address several of the issues that are of interest on both sides of the Atlantic. What happens in the midterms? What should we expect to be seeing? Does the midterm curse apply this time round? What is the impact of some of the recent legislative wins of the Biden administration? And also, what is the state of democracy in the United States? I mean, we're coming on the back of several years where there have been discussions about the quality of democracy in the United States, polarization, a very divisive debate about abortion rights and other issues. So how does all that play into the way Americans will vote, but also what will it mean for U.S. domestic and foreign policy, which is very much of interest on this side of the Atlantic. I'll turn to Bruce first for his presentation, and then we'll move to our speakers for 8 to 10 minutes each. A reminder to the audience, you're very welcome to use the chat function to already insert your questions, either the chat function or the Q&A function, and I'll pick them up later on in the Q&A. So Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for Lena, thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me, and it's great to be on the panel with so many distinguished guests and old friends. So I'll share some data we have on the run-up to the election and people's attitudes about things. And I know Mark's going to do the same thing. So let me start this sharing if I can. One thing that I think that before we start, we should remind ourselves, for the listeners who may not be familiar with our system, 435 members of the House of Representatives are on the ballot this November, but only a third of the 100-seat Senate is on the ballot. That's our standard. So every 2 years there's a House race. every 2 years, a third of the Senate. We are in an increasingly unstable democracy. In the 12 elections between 1952 and 1974, when the House, this part of the Senate, maybe the White House was up for election, there was a change of power in one or more of those 3 times. This will be the 12th election. In another cycle of 12 elections, we will have a change of power in 10 of those 12 elections. We, I must say, are becoming another one of those unstable democracies like Italy, or with all due respect to our friends in Britain. And so I do think that that's one of the things we have to accept and understand. The second is that Lainey mentioned that we're about 2 weeks out from the election. Do not expect to know. I think we'll know pretty rapidly on election night the control of the House. I don't know that we'll know by Wednesday morning that control of the Senate. That may take a little bit longer, and that will be a importantly contested event. If I can move on to the next slide here. What are the public's concerns? We are deeply divided along partisan lines on almost every issue. As you can see, there's a nearly 30-point difference on the economy. It's not the Democrats don't think it's an important issue, but the Republicans are much, much more worried about that. Democrats are much more worried about health care. Republicans are much more worried about violent crime. Again and again, and for European audiences, look at that, 68% of Democrats say climate change is a very important issue, only 9% of Republicans. This has policy implications in the next Congress. One thing I like to say to audiences is if you think the United States is divided along partisan lines, you don't understand American politics. We are even more divided than you can ever imagine. This word cloud just came out this morning from NBC News in terms of their interviews. Democrats are telling pollsters they want politicians to protect women's rights, which would suggest that abortion remains somewhat important issue, probably less so than it was a month ago, but still important for Democrats. And they want the government to be more effective. Republicans say we want you to fix the economy, reduce the cost of living. They also say they want the government to be more effective. So there is an underlying shared view here about effectiveness of government. This is a disturbing finding, though, in this NBC News poll. 81% of Democrats and 79% of Republicans believe the other party's agenda will destroy America. This is another reflection of the deep, deep partisanship. If my guy wins, things will be great. If the other guy wins, things are going to go to hell in a handbasket. So I think that we have to appreciate that building bridges in the new Congress is going to be very, very difficult. You don't build a bridge with someone who thinks that you think or your voters think is out to destroy America. What are the voting intentions? We do a thing called a preference poll, which is not district by district. Bear in mind that in most congressional districts, there is no independent polling. The vast majority of it districts. So we don't know what's going to happen in these individual districts. So this is a national poll of who will you vote for. The Republicans who had fallen behind in that preference have now kind of pulled ahead in a variety of polls. Each poll is a little bit different, but I think the general consensus is the Republicans have pulled ahead in this generic ballot, which is often, or has been in the past, the predictor of who's going to win. One thing that the Democrats have going for them is that women have voted at higher rates in both presidential and midterm elections for years. And this likely higher female turnout normally helps Democrats. And with abortion at least being, if not the first issue, which it may have been a couple of months ago, maybe the second or third issue for some voters, this might help the Democrats a bit. But women are split in the generic polling. In other words, this broad national poll, they're split between Republicans and Democrats. It is interesting. Republicans' advantages is with white, less educated, late middle-aged voters. These folks have actually turned out pretty well in past elections, so that is not a good sign for the Democrats. Biden and the president in general has an influence on how these things turn out. As you can see, Biden's popularity in this poll was at 38. Gallup came out with a poll today, it was at 40, but it's low. Now it's relatively low, but I mean, George W. Bush was higher, George H.W. Bush was higher, but Biden's not that different from where Trump was at his first midterm election, or where Obama was, or where Reagan was. So there is a history of presidents losing popularity as they go into their first midterm. The problem is when the president's popularity is in the low to mid 40s, his party tends to lose on average 37 seats in the House of Representatives. That is not a good sign for the Democrats. A modeling that came out today suggests the Democrats will lose at least 20 to 30 seats. That's better than 37 seats on average. But bear in mind, as long as you have control of the House of Representatives, you control the flow of legislation on the floor, you control the committees. We can get into what the committees are likely to be doing in the next House of Representatives, which has important foreign policy implications. The Senate is what's really up for grabs. If the House is lost to the Democrats, the question is that a 50-50 Senate, the Democrats lose one seat, they lose control of the Senate. I think most people think that it's the outcome in Georgia and Nevada that will determine the control of the Senate, although there was a debate last night in the Pennsylvania race. The Democratic candidate who'd been way ahead has been losing ground. He had a stroke. He did not do so well, it would appear, in the debate, according to most people who watched it. So we'll see how that works out for the Democrats. So I'll pass this back over to my next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Really informative, and also quite striking, the numbers of disapproval that you showed there, and not just disapproval, but perception that the other party will do a destructive job with regard to the future of the US. So really interesting. I'll move over to Sarah now. And Sarah, I understand you'll also be speaking to us about some of the state level issues. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Elena, for organizing this and for inviting the Progressive Policy Institute and myself to participate. I'm going to take us on sort of a winding country road away from Bruce, and hopefully Mark will bring us back. But I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the states and why what is happening in the states is going to be so determinative for us when we look at the 2024 presidential election. In midterm years, the national dialogue tends to zero in on Congress and which party will stay in power in the House and the Senate. And there is a little bit of a tendency to forget what's happening in the states. States elections are arguably very, very important when it comes to our bread and butter issues. More legislation is passing through state legislatures more and more every single year in comparison to Congress. And I think this year, at least in the wake of the SCOTUS Dobbs decision, there has been a return to looking at the states and what's happening now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned. But I do think that people do tend to forget that there's a big year and it is looking equally grim. Just to piggyback on a few things that Bruce said, Democrats are protecting more incumbent governors and attorney generals than they've had to protect in the last 18 years. So again, we've got a lot of things happening. There's 36 governor's races, 30 attorney general races, 27 secretaries of state on the ballot, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Similarly, in 2010, when President Obama had an approval rating in the midterms of about 44%, Democrats lost 6 gubernatorial seats. And then if you looked at 2018, when President Trump had a 41% approval rating walking into the midterms, Republicans lost 6 gubernatorial seats. So there is a natural ebb and flow and swing to the midterms that happens in the states as well as in Congress. But I do think there's a new aspect to this, and that is this new breed of Republicans that we're seeing. And I'm not sure if it's possible to start my slides now, Cecile. Great, and if we can go to the first slide, please. Or the next slide, please. I'm going to just keep talking while we're moving there. Great. Yeah. So the primaries, we've sort of had a reshaping of the Republican Party and a new cadre of GOP candidates that we're seeing right now. And I think an appropriate expression is Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. The Republican Party of 2022 is not the Republican Party even of 2020, let alone 2018 or 14 or 2010. The primaries featured a group of Trump acolytes even more extreme than the man himself. And sort of the number one litmus test or pledge really was claiming that the 2020 election was stolen, or that the Biden presidency is illegitimate because Trump really won. And that sort of new breed of election deniers has stoked very, very divisive rhetoric. And it's also led to this propagation of the big lie that is now everywhere and is really believed by a solid chunk of the Republican Party. I think in addition to that, there is, to Bruce's point, an extremism that's coming up. You just had to look at the Texas Republican Party convention that happened this spring, and to see a good example of how extreme these platforms are getting on the Republican side. And this new activist wing of the Republican Party is now becoming the mainstream when we look at the ballot. And I think things like how we are talking about the right to choose, talking about the Supreme Court and its expansion, talking about freedom of travel, or this big whiplash against COVID restrictions, talking about energy policy, again, to Bruce's point. These are all things that are coming up more and more in the states. I think the second big point here is that we have a decentralized electoral system, and that is going to play a big role in the next election cycle. Each state, just to run through this really quickly, and again, there are some serious variations here, so keep this as a broad general overview. But states have a lot of latitude in the administration of elections, and this varies widely based on laws from state to state, and even the way that it's administered varies county to county. But the general sort of system here is that a voter casts their ballot at their local polling location or precinct, and then that's reported to a county board of election, and then that's reported to a state board of election. There's a certification process in each state. Then that certified process sort of sends this up to Congress. Congress certifies those results, and then we have the results of the presidential election. That's in presidential years. And there are three main roles that participate in this and that have critical election roles. The first of which is secretaries of state. There are 39 secretaries of state out of the 50 states that are the chief election official of their state. So that means they administer and oversee a state election administration. They oversee certification of election results and the voter registration database. And then they support, of course, the local and regional election officials who are all part of the administration of elections in the states. You also have governors. Governors' key role and aspect are similar, but the most important one to note, especially in the context of 2024, is that governors can issue executive orders to improve intergovernmental coordination on election issues or address emergency situations that could be impacting elections. And we saw that during COVID. We saw a lot of measures come out of states that were brought by executive orders and of governors. And we also saw the codification of that in 2020 and 2021, which I'll get to at the end. Attorney generals also have key roles, and again, we have 30 of them up on the ballot this year. They act as the chief law enforcement officer. They can take legal action concerning voter fraud or intimidation or any type of election misconduct. They obviously represent the state and state agencies and various courts of laws, and they can really be involved in assuring voters receive accurate election information before and after elections. We can go to the next slide, please. So we have a really fun cast of characters running for Secretary of State across the country. 13 of the 27 seats currently have an election denier on the ballot, and you guys can take a peek here at some of our folks. But this is pretty important when we start looking at the certification of an election. And if we can go to the next slide. Here's a peek at the red states. Oh, sorry, back one. Here's a peek at a couple of states that we know are battleground states when you're talking in the presidential context. So Michigan, Ohio, Arizona, and Nevada. So should any of these candidates be successful this cycle around, it would just take one of them. It would just take one of them in a presidential year to not certify the election or to hold that up for us to be sort of left in limbo when it comes to our electoral college vote count. We can go to the next slide. Sorry, I know I'm out of time, Elena. Again, here's 19 of the 36 governors on the race have an election denier on the ballot. This is, again, has pretty devastating effects when we're talking about a 2024 context. If you want to go to the next slide, you can take a peek at the battleground states. So quite a few of them. And then if we look at attorneys general, so next slide. We have 10 out of the 30 for attorney generals who are election deniers on the ballot. And again, if we can go to the next slide, we can see a number of them are also in battleground states. And some of my last points, and I'll just really briefly touch on them, is just that there were some significant changes, and there have been some sort of after effects of COVID that I think are not often talked about, but should be talked about here. And that is that we do have a crisis in our poll workers and election officials, in the sense of there's a lot of intimidation happening there. 1 out of every 6 election officials have experienced threats. 1 out of every 3 know at least one election worker who has left their job in part because of threats and fears for their safety. And 2 in 3 local election officials believe that false information is making their job more dangerous and more hard to execute. The Brennan Center did a really interesting review of this summer, and their report is something that everybody should take a peek at. And then also something I touched on briefly earlier, and that's that in 2020, there were a lot of panic about COVID and COVID restrictions and how that would affect elections. And many states and governors in particular moved to make sure that people had access to vote and could vote safely. And what we saw coming out of that is that a lot of those different things were codified into law in 2020 and also 2021. And I think that there were some interesting takeaways there. A lot of the conversation, back to our polarization that Bruce mentioned on the Democratic side of the aisle, was how much states restricted voting access and made it more difficult. But on the Republican side, there hasn't been as much talk about actually how many states expanded access. Most common expansions were increasing voter registration access opportunities, increasing early vote, establishing vote by mail systems. And I think that there are some interesting examples here, because Democrats tend to think that the more people who vote, it will help Democrats, generally speaking, by and large. And I think that there are some interesting examples in 2021. If we look at a state like Montana, where actually expansion of the vote and expansion of people voting did not benefit us. If anything, it really had the opposite effect. And I think that there are a couple other examples there that we can look at, and time will tell. And I think the midterms is the first time we're really going to see what the effects of these various laws are going to have on voting and turnout in general. And we'll have to probably live through a few cycles to make any sort of determinative assessments, but I do think that that is an aspect that's not talked about. And then the last that I'll leave you with, to Bruce's point that we are not going to know the election results in the evening, is just that if you look at 2021 at the New Jersey governor's race, Jack Ciattarelli was a pretty mild Republican. He was not a MAGA Trump acolyte type Republican by any stretch of the imagination. And even still, even though he had absolutely no numerical path to victory, it took him 11 days to concede. So I think something that we are going to be looking at on election night, and we've already seen a taste of this if you're watching what the Secretary of State candidates and the governor's candidates and the Attorney General candidates are saying on the Republican side of the aisle, is that we aren't going to know who won in a lot of these races unless really and truly the numbers, there's no shadow of a doubt. And I think that that's a big thing for it's going to be a big challenge for us, and it's only going to fuel the public's potential worry or distrust in the actual system itself. Sorry, to Mark.
Thank you very much, Sarah. No, but thank you for zooming in on those issues and sort of on the map, if I may say so. But also because you brought up this all important issue that democracy is also as good as the resilience of the process and the people who carry it out and the legal framework. And also by bringing in this conversation about election deniers, I think there's a lot that we can pick up on in the Q&A about also what Trump endorsements have meant in terms of certain candidates in the state primaries, and what is the state of within the GOP, but also within the Democratic Party. What are the parties looking like now? But that's for the Q&A. I move now to Mark. Mark, if I've counted correctly, you have over 20 years of experience working on Capitol Hill, so we're very much looking forward to your comments as well.
So, good. I just want to, I'm going to repeat some of the stuff that Bruce said, but I'll make a different emphasis just to make the point. But I think Bruce was a pretty solid analysis there. If you look at this, it really goes back to the Civil War in the 1860s. Only 3 times has the president's party won seats in the midterm election. Whether it's the midterm curse or whether it's just history of the first election almost always being a referendum on the new president, whose programs haven't had a chance to develop yet. It's always a very negative thing. The big exception, there were 2 exceptions in recent history, was in 2002, George H.W. Bush won seats in the House. Remember, that was right after 9/11. President was very popular at the time, and there was a big debate over whether or not to open a Homeland Security Department. And the time before that was Bill Clinton in his second midterm. He lost to Congress in the first midterm, but in the second midterm, they actually unseated. Part of that's because the Republicans were impeaching him, and it kind of was a backlash against him over the Monica Lewinsky scandal. It doesn't hold quite as true in the Senate. In the Senate, they do not go along necessarily with what the House is doing. But that's also because Senate races tend to be more personality driven and less party and issues driven. I'm trying to get my thing to advance here. Okay, here we go. Also make a point just to show an illustration of what happens when the president's approval rating is below 50%, lose an average of 36 seats. Right now, if you look at Joe Biden's approval rating, it's very comparable to what Barack Obama's was at this point in his presidency. And Obama has suffered a huge loss in the 2010 midterm elections, his first midterm. And the 44% may be generous compared to some of the other surveys I've seen. But all 4 of the last presidents are interesting. All 4 of them at some point lost control of the Congress. Now, Bill Clinton lost it. He had 2 years of Democrat majority, then he lost control to Republicans. George W. Bush kept it. It was his 6th year that he lost control of Congress, but Barack Obama had a Democrat majority, a supermajority in the Senate, 60 votes, and ended up losing control of the House and the Senate in the first midterms. And he ended up and then Donald Trump, of course, lost control of the Congress in his first midterm. So it happens to all presidents. One of the things I should also tell you is that Americans are relatively comfortable with divided government. People from other countries look at, well, how can both parties be in charge at the same time? It's a good question, but we do it. And Americans almost kind of like that because they are naturally suspicious of concentrated power, and anything that stops anything dramatic from happening at the top they're usually more comfortable with. The second aspect I want to emphasize is that Americans are in an angry place right now. It's been over 20 years since more people were satisfied with the way things are going in the country than it is now. So this spreads out across multiple administrations, multiple parties. Americans just are not terribly happy about things. A majority of voters say the government is corrupt and rigged against people like them. As you can imagine right now, with the Democrats in charge, fewer Democrats say that, but 66% of the people think the Republicans think the government is corrupt and rigged. Importantly, 63% of independents think that too. And independents are probably the ones who are going to determine this election. And both sides look at the other side. Ask Republicans, do you generally think the other sides are bullies who want to impose their beliefs? Yes, 74%. Ask the Democrats and 2 Republicans, 73%. And if you can come away from one thing from both Bruce and my presentation is you cannot overstate the polarization between the two parties. It's just, I've never seen it like this. I've been around, I started on the Hill during the Reagan administration. I've never seen it like this where there's just no willingness to work together. In fact, there's almost political danger in working together. Do you think the country's democracy is in danger of collapse? Both parties, 69% Republicans and 69% Democrats, agree they think the democracy is in trouble. Now, for different reasons, oftentimes, but nonetheless, I think this goes to the point of both the speakers who went before me is that Americans are kind of uncertain about the future of their democracy too, which probably means we ought to start listening to each other a whole lot more and not stop shouting at each other. But that's just a brief public service announcement. All right, right now, the Senate is divided 50-50. The House has a very narrow Democrat majority, 221 to 212. So everything is super close. But as you recall, in the United States system, the Vice President of the United States is the President of the Senate and can break a tie. So if it's a 50-50 Senate, she votes with the Democrats on their organizing resolution, the Democrats in the majority. So for the Democrats to maintain control, they just have to keep their 50 votes. Republicans need to pick up just one seat to change everything. If you look at the close races are in the middle there, the Warnock and Cortez Masto is, I think Nevada's probably actually already gone, but Georgia's going to be very close. Arizona has a chance to be close too. Colorado is interesting. The reason why Bennett is having a tough race is because O'Day is actually an anti-Trump candidate who Trump denounced, and all of a sudden he's doing much better in that race. But the reason why the Republicans are doing much worse in New Hampshire is that they backed the Trump-endorsed candidate who was obviously not as strong as the mainstream Republican candidate in that New England state. On the Republican side, you have the Pennsylvania seat, which is opened. Senator Toohey is stepping down. Ron Johnson's there. I think Wisconsin, Johnson's looking like he has that. But as everyone says, Pennsylvania is a wide open seat. Rubio's really no longer in trouble. North Carolina and Ohio, I think, are sort of shaping up. They'll be close races. Utah's an interesting race because an independent candidate is running against the current Senator Lee. And he's actually polled very well. The Democrats did not nominate somebody and left an independent who was promised not to caucus with either party, which means I don't know how they organize the Senate, if it's a 50-50 Senate or 50-49, which would be really interesting. If it's 50-49, the vice president can't break a tie. So it could be very interesting. There's a couple other races to keep an eye on. Murkowski, only because she's actually running as an independent, but it's one of those ranked choice system voting. She should be fine. Grassley's always been very popular. He's a little bit older. There's another state out in the state of Washington, a race that all of a sudden both parties are sticking a lot of money into, even though no one's seen any polls, where Senator Patty Murray is facing a first-time challenger in this case. So if the night is a big swing one way or the other, we'll see a lot of these extra races. But for the most part, I think you're going to see it comes down to really these three states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. If the Republicans hold and pick up Nevada, like most people think they will now, it means the Republicans in one of those states, they have a majority. That's Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona. Yeah, that and a close night. Pennsylvania, it took them how long did it take less? About a week to count their votes after the presidential. Georgia was up doing recounts for a long time. Arizona's a late state, so we may not know immediately who controls the Senate based on the fact that they're very slow counting states. And the House, again, we'll get you these slides if you want them. You don't have to sort of memorize all these names, but it gives you an idea of the toss-up seats. If you look in the Republican columns, they've already picked up a bunch of Democrat seats, partly because of redistricting, partly because of who's stepping down. Right now, the Republicans have picked up about 9 seats before you get to any of the toss-up races, which means that that's enough for a majority. No, just short. I'm sorry. These are 211. So then they would have to actually then pick up just a small portion of the toss-up seats. And as you see, a lot more Democrat seats are vulnerable than were before. The Cook report moved a whole bunch of the races in the lean Democrat over to toss-up this morning. that it's going to be very tough for the Democrats to win all those seats and then hold on to the majority. That's why I think everyone thinks history is going to continue for a lot of reasons, but just the way the map is set up, it's going to be a very difficult year for the Democrats. You will look, there are 3 very competitive races in Virginia. 3 women are running. Let's see, it's let's see, Lurie and Kagan in the 2nd, and Spanberger and Vega in the 7th are interesting races because it's women against women. And it's, but the polls close at 7 o'clock in Virginia. So if those races are turning over, they switch from Democrat to Republican, it'll be a good indication that it's going to be a good Republican night. I'll do that. Okay. In this, I was summarizing a little bit. The Democrats had a good summer. Right? You know, the Dobbs decision was a boost. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that it's not like this is a new issue. It's been an issue for 50 years. Most people know what they think, and most people have a nuanced view of when they think abortion should be allowed and when they shouldn't be allowed. So it was a big boost in terms of Democrat enthusiasm for Democrat women, but not any other voter group was significantly affected by it, making it the most important issue. Besides people who are already fairly committed to the Democrat side, it increased enthusiasm for them, which I think could help. Gas prices came down a little bit, but now they're headed back up.
Mark, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because the time has been over for a while, and I'm conscious that Leslie will have to leave us in less than 10 minutes. So if you don't mind, can we move on to Leslie, and then I can come back to you if you want to conclude.
My pleasure. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I tried to signal it in the chat, but I'm very sorry about that. But I will come back to you.
I was actually thoroughly enjoying it, so.
I was sure you were, but I thought maybe we'd give you a chance because I understand less than 7 minutes to go. So maybe we move to Leslie and hear listen to her comments, and then we'll go back to Mark after Leslie had left us. So Leslie,
that's great.
And apologies, Mark, for that. We'll come back to you.
No, Elena, thank you. And thank you to everybody who's made this possible, and especially to Bruce, Mark, and Sarah, who I've already learned so much from. And Mark, I'm delighted to be able to jump in just as you were talking about abortion and the Dobbs decision, not moving that many people, increasing intensity of preferences, but, getting women out. I still wonder what happens on the day, because, sort of my hidden question in the back of my mind, we all have young people in our lives, is do you really want to be the parent of the 20-year-old boy who suddenly is father to a child that he didn't really want to? So, I mean, I think that it's complicated. And maybe it won't affect turnout in the day, but I'm sort of waiting for maybe some of our assumptions to be tested. I'm sure we're all waiting for our polling and our assumptions to be tested. And so one of my responses to all of this is, how much does the day look like what we're assuming is driving things? And especially that movement that Bruce talked about from September to October, where September looked much better for the Democrats and October has looked much better for the Republicans. But, it's the election's taking place in November, even though people are early voting. Let me just say a couple things, and maybe I'll jump onto policy and what it may or may not mean for policy pretty quickly. I do, though, quickly want to say I see this as clearly this is, about many, many things, but I do see it as despite all the really difficult things that Bruce said, we are more divided than we've ever been. But as Bruce and others have mentioned, the turnout is extraordinary. Elena mentioned, the midterms are on the map since 2018, never more than before. And I don't say this in any kind of naive way, but it is a good news story for democracy. If I'm right, 122 million Americans voted in 2018 in midterm elections. And I think we're going to see more, but you tell me, because you all know the numbers better. But that is quite extraordinary. It means that people are not apathetic. And I would even argue that a number of people who won't vote are also not apathetic, but they've decided the most effective way to vote, and I don't agree with them, but they feel that the most effective way to vote politics is not through Congress, not through political parties. So I think there's even a lower degree of apathy than the turnout will tell us. So that's and civil society tells us a lot about that. Protest on the street tells a lot about that. So I think that, there is a robust level, heightened level of democratic contestation taking place across the country in small towns and large towns and cities. And I think that that's significant. There might be a lot more if, God forbid, there are contested elections or violence, et cetera. In terms of policy, I'll say two quick things, and I defer to Mark and Bruce and Sarah, but I'll say my take on two things. One is domestically, that the two things that I really see as being very much at stake. One is abortion rights, because the Republicans and the Democrats have suggested that they're going to put this on the table for legislating if they are able. So that is significant. I see that as tremendously significant, not only for the decision, but for the politics that then follow from that, because nothing is one shot. Every decision that's made on a woman's right to choose leads to another multiple layers of politics and litigation and legislation at the state level as well as at the federal level. Secondly, judges, as I understand it, if the Democrats hold the Senate, they can do something about the federal bench. There are 87 vacancies, 44 nominees, and it takes holding the Senate to get that through. I think Bruce will confirm that for me. He's the expert. All of you are the experts. On foreign policy, I see the number one issue as climate. I've always seen the number one issue as climate in terms of, we talk about, and I will say a word about China and Russia, but we do talk about more bipartisanship rather than less when it comes certainly to China and to Russia, although that's more complicated. But we never talk about that in the climate change. And Donald Trump, did all of us a terrible favor in ensuring that climate denialism and that science is something that the basics of which remain fundamentally and deeply contested in significant and substantial parts of the Republican Party. Joe Biden struggled and succeeded in getting that Inflation Reduction Act through. It is, from everybody I listen to who's expert in the sectors, it is not a small thing. It is a significant thing. I think Europeans are even worried about the competitive aspects of it when it comes to hydrogen, but it's highly consequential. It's highly significant. I don't think, and again, my colleagues on the panel will tell us, but I don't think that this election will lead to a reversal, because there isn't going to be Republicans getting a 2/3 majority that they need in order to pass legislation that would really set this back. But it will lead to a Republican majority, will lead to a lot of oversight, watching what's happening on spending, politics on it, a platform for rhetoric that is empowering climate denialism in a way that will really move the needle, not only publicly and with respect to policy, but consequentially in the run-up to the 2024 elections. So climate is the number one issue that I think is at stake, and it's really, really a big deal. And we know how hard it is, even with the Democrats in charge across the board. There is also, and again, I think my colleagues can say more about the SEC's putting forward a rule which would require companies to tell their investors more about the climate risk that they carry. That hasn't gone through. It should, I think, still go through, quite possibly or probably. Regardless of this result, I don't know, but it's certainly contested and will become that much more contested. So watch out for climate. It's a big deal. It matters a lot to everybody. And it matters to shaping public opinion. And if you look race by race in some of those really key states where you've got, Georgia, for example, Pennsylvania, the candidates that are, running neck and neck have a very different view on renewables. They have a very different view on fracking, and they have a very different view on doubling down on oil and gas. Second thing on China, I think, bipartisan consensus, we know that, but what I think will change as there's a stronger voice from the Republicans, if that's what happens, is that the Biden administration's intention to have two tracks, compete with China and cooperate with China, will become much more difficult. Biden's still going to be president. The president's still really driving foreign policy. The National Security Council is committed to these two tracks. It's already extremely tricky, as we know from export controls and the CHIPS Act. However, I don't think the Republicans have much of an interest in cooperating with China. They don't care about climate as much. So I think they're very happy to double down on the competition, to focus on the Communist Party, to make it much more ideological. So even though we have a strong majority of Americans who are, want a harder line on China, there's still a lot of details in what that looks like. And I think that this election matters for what direction that goes. And then finally on Russia, we've seen the politics over Russia. The big question is, what happens to U.S. support for Russia? Was the contestation, the pushback from certain parts of the Republican Party more tied up with wanting to hold back on the Inflation Reduction Act, or is that going to remain the case? I think some people would say it's going to get tricky. It's clearly linked to what happens with inflation, with the economy. But I'm perhaps a little bit more agnostic, but be probably more less pessimistic, because I think when the rubber hits the road, Americans want to support Ukraine. It's kind of stayed strong. It's been solid. And if Russia doubles down, as they have been, on targeting civilians, if those images are in the paper, support for NATO has been strong. I think that support will hold. And we saw the progressives, AOC and a few others, put forward a letter saying we need to negotiate and then walk it back within 24 hours because they don't want to be associated with this wing of the Republican Party, and because the letter was dated and many other things. So it's up for grabs. We all know it's going to get more complicated, but I am quite optimistic that the U.S. will remain solid in its support for Ukraine, because it's not all about Congress. I'll stop there. And I've thoroughly enjoyed all of your presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And I have to say, out of the 5 questions I've seen so far, you've addressed 4 more or less about China, trade and tech, climate. What if the next president withdraws from the Paris Agreement? Kind of tangentially there. So thank you for that already. So it's as if we had you in the Q&A section. Goodbye. But I'm conscious that I promised Mark conclusions. So Mark, before I open the Q&A officially, I'll give the floor back to you. And you can, everyone deserves their concluding remarks. So I'll let you conclude, and then we'll open the floor up to questions.
But it goes to what we were discussing before. This is the main issue, is that while it was a good, let's see, go.
It's there.
Okay, there we go. The biggest issue is how the parties break down on the big issues: the economy, illegal immigration, crime and policy. See, the Republicans have a clear advantage. Abortion, climate and change, Democrats have a clear advantage. The problem is that this is the biggest question right here. What's the issue? Societal issues like abortion, guns, or democracy, or economic issues such as job, taxes, or the cost of living? And overwhelmingly, Republicans and independents say it's the economic issues, which pretty much decides it. And this is just a breakdown of the intensity of the votes. But yeah, the problem for the Democrats really in this whole thing is that they ended up, get me back to my screen here. Okay, there we go. They ended up with a situation where the issue matrix just hadn't worked out in their favor. Partly there's inflation, which presidents get blamed for, but the Federal Reserve does more to do with that than anything else. But also the fact of not talking about inflation has also hurt a lot of the Democrats. It's an interesting race because I think, and this will be my concluding remarks, just to get that out, is that you've seen a lot of positive things in terms of elections. In Georgia, which there was a whole protest about Georgia's laws, they've had a 127% increase already this year from the midterm elections 4 years ago in terms of early voting. So a lot of that, the jury is still out on that sort of thing. But I think you're going to see a pretty much a historical midterm election that's in line with things. The Republicans should pick up 25 to 30 seats. I think the Republicans probably narrowly win the Senate. And the good thing is in 2 weeks, you can check me. And I can explain to you why I was completely wrong in everything I predicted.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. I think we've heard very interesting things all across the board in terms of voter intentions, forecasts, but also policy issues. And it's reflected in the questions we're receiving. So we've already received a number of questions. I'm going to try to group them. I think One question stands out in terms of asking a specific question about a race. So there's a question from Xavier Bento, our colleague in the EP, about regarding the Senate race in Nevada, and is it still looking so bad for Democrats as pollsters have a history of overestimating Republicans in the state? So maybe that would go to all of you, actually, Mark, Sarah, and Bruce. But a second question relates to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and a colleague, Annie Gunnarsson, asks, did that happen? Did the whole issue of abortion and the overturning of Roe versus Wade happen too soon in the race to affect undecided voters to not vote Republican? Or is it still a very salient issue? And perhaps you could make a comment with regard to that, and perhaps even broaden that to, do voters think of the most recent issue, or is it sort of an accumulation of grievances that will guide their decisions, maybe somewhere in between the two? And then I have a whole host of questions actually on transatlantic relations from my colleagues Marcin Czapansky and Gisela Grieger, and they are basically asking if there is a shift of power and there is divided government, what are the implications on transatlantic relations, particularly cooperation on trade and tech, on climate issues, with which Leslie alluded to, digital issues and taxation issues, which we haven't talked about at all, but sort of OECD, global minimum tax. So let's start with this round of questions, and then I'll get back to you with the next round. So maybe we can start with, I'd say reverse order with Mark, but Mark spoke last, so maybe I'll start with Sarah this time, and we'll go reverse order.
Sure. I would just start with the question on Nevada. So Nevada is pretty interesting, especially since a lot of what I've been doing is looking at where is the Senate race, which is a statewide race, also diverging from the governor's race. We do see actually some splits in what I would call our 11 battlegrounds for governors, but Nevada is actually not one of them. So that's an interesting case. And I think there's a couple of factors here at play. One, Nevada was very badly hit economically during the COVID pandemic, and those economics are really playing out. So while you have a slightly more educated state in the sense that a larger part of the public has some form of college education, and you would think that that might benefit in some ways when you're looking at issues like abortion, et cetera, you really do have this convergence of, I think, economic and then issues of crime happening. You also have a large white working class in Nevada, and you also have a Hispanic vote in Nevada that you can't sort of ignore. And I think both of those demographics are really trending away from the Democratic Party in this sort of most recent polling as terms of what we can see. I would have hoped that CCM Masto's sort of history as a prosecutor and her background would have helped insulate her a little bit more. But it really hasn't, and it's just not a place even for Governor Sisolak, where we're seeing with other governors, their internal approval rating is really helping to separate them and buoy them against, say, the drag from the president's numbers. You're just not seeing that in Nevada. In fact, you're seeing them both pegged together. And I do think also it helps in that race a little bit that Lombardo, who's running against Sisolak, is not an election denier, strangely. But yeah, I think Nevada is, as both Mark and Bruce said, a little bit lost at this point when it comes to that Senate race. And then I would even argue the governor's race. But again, maybe I will be proven wrong. And I'll let others take the question about Roe and Walker.
Thank you very much. Mark, to any of those questions.
All good points. I think Nevada is an interesting state, but the interesting thing is the incumbent senator at Masto is a Latina senator, but she's trailing amongst the Hispanic vote, which gives you an idea. You can't, the Republican Party has transformed, and Bruce alluded to this too. It was the party of the highly educated, highly income Republicans, and it's become really a working class party. And by the Hispanic vote movement is a subset of that working class movement that they've increased, and it changes turnouts in all the models, because you Republicans used to always be able to count on strong turnout because of the highly educated background. Now that's switching to the Democrats. But there's just so many transformations happening. I think on Roe v. Wade too is that to a certain degree the Republicans weren't ready for the decision or the reaction to it, and it took them a long time to find their footings. And to a certain extent, it's an important issue, as I said, to find groups of people who it's always the most important issue in an election. And those people are more magnified in their beliefs now than they were, and they wouldn't have missed this election for all the tea in China. So they're going to be turning out. But part of the problem is the Democrats also didn't have a real answer. They had a national law that basically had no exceptions at any point. And Republicans start hitting back, and the issues become kind of muddy. So I think just in terms of the politics of that statement, the Democrats had the enthusiasm first, the Republicans to kind of figure out how to take a stand, and the issue is becoming more neutral than it was before. And the question on Senator Walker, Senator Georgia race, right? Yeah, I think to a certain degree, Walker is, he had this terrible scandal, right? You'd say that, like, can you imagine surviving that? If it's true, or if it's not true, it usually costs you very dearly. But there's a terrible thing that's happened in American politics, and I leave my colleagues here to see if they agree with this or not, is that Americans have come to be so suspect of their political candidates that they kind of expect them to be flawed people. And it doesn't seem to have the political damage that it did before. Not to mention people so polarized say, well, I'd rather vote for my crook than your crook. It's a strange phenomenon of which, character used to be the primary determinant of people who ran for offices. And it really, it goes back to Trump's original election in 2016. Things that we thought you could never get away with, he survived. So.
Thank you for this, Bruce. I'm thinking you might pick up the issue on transatlantic issues given your task force experience, but also feel free to comment on any of the other questions.
Yeah, I mean, first off, to pick up on Mark's final point, my father, who was a Republican but hated politicians, used to say, sometimes you have to throw the bums out and get new bums. And I have never forgotten that statement. And I think it's even more the case today in American politics that there is a sense of let's try somebody else. And as Mark said, there were things about Donald Trump when he ran in 2016 that you thought would have disqualified him and he would have been able to win. It didn't happen. Things that are alleged to have happened or been done by the Georgia Republican candidate, you would think this is going to disqualify the guy. It doesn't seem to have done that. He's running neck and neck. On the Democratic side, I mean, Fetterman, the candidate in Pennsylvania for the Democrats, had a stroke, has had difficulty recovering. And he may still win, even though his debate last night would suggest he's still somewhat impaired. And you might have thought that would be disqualifying. But he certainly has lost the lead he once had. So it has had an impact. So, I mean, we just don't know how this is going to play out. To get to the question of the impact this is going to have on transatlantic relations and on the U.S. relationship with the world, I mean, I think the listeners have to realize a couple of things. With the Republicans will gain control of the House. I think that's indisputable. That means that they can decide what legislation goes to the floor, which means that there will be legislation that maybe won't pass the Senate, or maybe the president will veto, but it will be legislation that will be a Republican's agenda, which I think some Europeans may find difficult to swallow or deal with or understand. I think more importantly, it means they control the committees. That means they will launch investigations at committees. The Republicans have already said they want to create a select committee on China. That is going to be, a committee that looks into how bad China is, and that will further poison relations with China, make it maybe more difficult for Europeans on some issues to cooperate with the United States on China. It certainly will stir up the China issue in American politics. They have threatened to investigate Hunter Biden, who is the president's son, and his business dealings, both with China and with Ukraine, which will further poison the well on Ukraine support because it will raise issues of corruption, etc., even if they're not proven, even if they're not true. And we already have the future Republican Speaker of the House, McCarthy, at least raising the possibility that it will be harder to get aid for Ukraine in a Republican-controlled House. Staffers on Capitol Hill, Republican staffers on Capitol Hill tell me they think that's the case. I think it's not a question that the House won't pass aid, but it may be less than it has been in the past. And you embolden people on the extreme right of the Republican Party who say we shouldn't be doing this. We should be doing things at home. If Trump actually does run for president again, which is every indication he will, he's already said that Russia invaded Ukraine because we provoked them. That he has echoed these comments that we are spending too much on Ukraine and not enough on ourselves. And this feeds into a widely shared public view in the United States that predates Trump even, that woe is us, we are the victims of the world, we do everything and the world does nothing. And so there's going to be a sense of, no one's really with us, even though the Europeans have done a lot. And there'll be more finger pointing across the Atlantic around these issues, I think, and the public will support some of that finger pointing. All of this is going to get much more difficult, I think, next year. On trade issues, and there were a number of issues on trade, I don't think there's much of an impact on trade. The Trade and Technology Council is doing what it's doing. It's not quite sure how much they're doing, but the bigger problem is nobody knows what they're doing. They claim they're doing a lot of things, but it's not at all as clear as maybe it should be to the public. It is interesting, these export controls that were just announced by the administration on high-end computer chips and the machines that make them and the people who make them, with regard to China, was done in a unilateral fashion. Now, people tell me there was consultation with the Dutch or the Koreans or whoever, the Japanese, but they didn't come along on this, right? So this could lead to problems down the road. And certainly the Inflation Reduction Act has trade problems embedded in it because we're basically going to subsidize the assembly of electric vehicles in the United States, but we're not going to provide the same subsidies if you buy a BMW that was assembled in Germany that's an electric vehicle. So there's going to be a problem with that, it seems to me, in transatlantic relations because of some of the things that the administration has done on climate change, but it's also industrial policy. And I think those are be one of the trade issues we're going to have to wrestle with for the next 2 years. And it potentially could get ugly. We just don't know.
Thanks, Bruce. And I know that I think it was this morning that we learned that a EU-US task force on the Inflation Reduction Act has just been set up. And I guess part of the trade and tech impact is the socialization. So immediately there's a forum there where they're trying to resolve or smooth out whatever effects, I guess, internal legislation is having on the other side. You're muted, but Bruce, you're muted.
I agree with you. There's a history of this. This is the way to deal with this, to say, look, we're going to kick the can down the road. We're going to have consultations. Maybe we can figure out side deals that somehow alleviate concerns. So that's actually a very good sign, because it's notable that the EU did not immediately say we're going to take this to the WTO. Brussels clearly doesn't want to fight over this. Frankly, taking something to the WTO, as one American official said to me, make our day. I mean, you take it to the WTO to die, right? It's not, the dispute settlement mechanism is broken thanks to us, right? Thanks to the Americans. So this is the way to proceed.
Thank you. We have another question which relates to China, but it also has to do with the potential legislative gridlock, again by my colleague Gisela Greger. She's asking, How can the US successfully compete in the long term with a China where a single strongman can make sure that there are no political or funding obstacles to achieving their strategic goals, if on the US side, a strongly polarized two-party system will mean legislative gridlock in the next 2 years, and if a potential Republican-led Congress reverses at least parts of the transformative legislation enacted by Democrats during the past 2 years? So I'll ask you to respond to that and then finish with the last round of questions after that. And Mark, I've noted you wanted to intervene, so I'll start with you.
Thanks. No, I think interesting points. This should be noted that the Republicans have put out a document on their campaign about what they would do on a whole bunch of issues. I mean, it was very specific, like 72 main points. But I think the foreign affairs areas that the Republicans are interested in working in are not things that you will find terribly uncomfortable. For instance, working on supply chains, particularly medical supply chains, to make sure that our essential medications don't go through China, but are made with allied nations. So you could have an agreement there that I think they would advance. I think the other thing you'll see a lot of is energy. I mean, we got it, you want it, right? I mean, we can spend a lot of money on increasing U.S. production, at the same time getting you inexpensive, cheap natural gas as well, since you're going to need it for a long time from another source. So I think there's some issues that there'll be a natural working together. And NATO still has enormous support within the Republican Party. Kevin McCarthy's remarks were that, we're not going to write a blank check, which if I were the administration, I said, but we haven't. We have been very careful with how we spent the money. I think there's been a call in the Republican Party for an inspector general to watch over these funds, which $60 billion is a lot of money. So it's not an inconsequential amount of money that we're spending. But yeah, as I said, then the Democrats stumbled into it with the Progressive Caucus coming out and saying, well, let's negotiate with Mr. Putin, which was a mistake on their part. And the Democrat Party, to their credit, really shut that down very quickly. But that gives you an idea of what the foreign policy issues are in the United States. Under no demographic group is foreign policy even in the top 5. And I include that with the war in Ukraine, with all the rhetoric about nuclear weapons going, it is a domestic election. It's going to be determined by American domestic issues. And as long as inflation remains bad, that's going to be the main issue. To a certain degree, I think the administration made a mistake in calling it the Inflation Reduction Act because it didn't reduce inflation, and they announced it the day inflation went up. They should have called it the Climate Change Act because it really did more in that area than it certainly did to reduce inflation.
I think just to add to that too, Americans are crazy about gas prices. We won't weather the energy increases I think that you guys are weathering on the other side of the pond as easily in terms of our politics. Not in this election, on the next election. I actually think that the economics of climate, I don't 100% agree with what Leslie's analysis was when she said that she felt like there was just such a hard rift that you can't go anywhere. Because I actually think the economics of climate change is a stronger mover on the Republican side of the aisle than people give it credit for. And not to point back to the states, but you do have a lot of collaboration between Republican and Democratic states. If you just even look at, say, the Hydrogen Hub MOU, which was money that came out of IIJA, that's Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, right? That's 2 Republican states and 2 Democratic states who economically need to have a future for LNG, right? So you do have some areas of collaboration there. And I do think that the economics there is going to push the Republican Party to look at new technologies, to adjust their economies, look at what McMaster's doing down in South Carolina when it comes to building cars and a green transition to electric vehicles. There's a lot there. And again, I do think the innovation is in the states, and often they are ignored and we focus on what Congress is passing. But a lot of what we're going to see and what the future is for energy in the United States and that conversation on climate is really here. But we do have that political difference in we will not weather changes in terms of the economics of energy as well as you all will. Maybe Europe does 1 or 2 cold winters. America would barely do a cold winter, right? So I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind when we have that conversation. I think also back to the funding question on Ukraine dollars, the Senate is a good blocker there, despite sort of the bluster of McCarthy right now and what the House may or may not do. I do think that the main kind of stay in the Senate is to stick the course and to protect democracy and be a beacon of light and hope, right? So I do think that that is hopefully where we're going to stay and where we're gonna go. I did want to go back, if I may, really quickly, just to the abortion question, because there's two things that I feel have not actually been said, and I do think they're quite important. One is that abortion is not viewed as an economic issue by most voters, but I do think you see a difference between Democrats and Republicans, obviously, but also women when it comes to that. There's been a lot of conversation. I'm a mom of two. There are, many mothers, but I think that there's a lot of conversation in those circles about the economic impacts of abortion, how much it costs to give birth in the United States of America, how much it costs to raise a child in the United States of America. And the Democratic Party has largely been unsuccessful. We've sort of attacked this as like, they're coming after your rights, full stop. And we haven't actually been successful in pegging it to the economic question, which is really what is moving a lot of voters this cycle. And I think that that's a little bit to our detriment. I think also people tend to view abortion as a one-time thing or a one-time instance. So it's not something that is your day-to-day. It's not your gas bill every week. It's not your groceries every week. And I think that that also sort of pushes it further out. But if we had worked more successfully to sort of elucidate how much of an economic issue abortion is for the United States of America, we might actually see it play a little bit more strongly this cycle, in my opinion.
Thanks, Sarah. I know I have to move to Bruce for his response, but I have a follow-up on the abortion question, and it's more about, the voters, if you don't mind, Bruce. I mean, we did see already in the presidential election, the sort of Cindy McCain, if I might call it that, phenomenon of Republican women voting for the Democrats. And so we did see a move, if I remember correctly, of women shifting their vote from Republican to Democrat in some states. So do you think we should expect to see more of that because of the abortion related issues? Because I think the question was also getting to that was posed in the chat.
For me or for
You're muted.
Sarah?
I'm going back to Sarah, and then I'll turn to you, Bruce, for this and more.
I would be interested in Mark and Bruce's analysis, but I do think that suburban women, you may see a shift in suburban women on this issue in particular. Now, I think the question is amongst sort of independents and swings, is abortion going to be their number one issue? No, but is it going to be a motivator and an energizer for women to come out and vote? Yes. And those are kind of those two aspects, right? We need not just turnout, but we also need independents to break for Democrats in order to pull us into keeping our majorities. I do also think you can look at states like Kansas that are really interesting. Not just their ballot initiative, which I think was one of the most well-run campaigns I've seen in a long time, because many of those ads didn't even say the word abortion. But I think you can look at districts that are traditionally Republican but end up voting for Democrats quite a bit because they are districts full of Republicans that are actually pro-choice Republicans. And I think that looking at a race like Kansas, in a state where really and truly Laura Kelly shouldn't be able to hold that state, but her approval is still at 55% and she's still pushing, forward there, that you really are maybe seeing an abortion element to that amongst, again, suburban women and suburban voters. Will it be the deciding factor? No, unfortunately.
Thank you. Bruce, to you. And Mark, I've noted you want to follow up, but I'll turn to Bruce first, and then we'll have final remarks.
Well, on the abortion issue, I mean, I think we'll know after the election where was there increased turnout and who turned out, and if it turns out to be young women, suburban women, I think we could then surmise that many of them turned out because they were still upset about abortion. It was interesting that NBC News word cloud that I put up earlier that just came out today. Women's rights and the protection of women's bodies was the number one thing mentioned by Democrats. So it's still in by that measure, it is still a very important issue for Democrats. If you ask people their issues, it's the economy now more than abortion. So you pick your interpretation here, but I do think to go back to the other point about foreign policy issue, foreign policies are not a key issue. They've never a key issue in these elections. But I think they will have foreign policy implications. And while Mark's right that I think that there is an agreement on both Ukraine and China that's pretty strong. I worry about the erosion of that unity over time, because what people are willing to do becomes, much more differentiated as we get down the road and we have talk about what policies to pursue. And on Ukraine in particular, Morning Consult has a poll, which I think is interesting and bearing watching, where they ask people, are we doing too much about enough or too little to help Ukraine? Always be wary of three-part questions because people don't know. So they say in the middle, yes, it's about right. But the percentage of Republicans who say we are doing too much has gone up, and the percentage of Republicans who say we're not doing enough has gone down. And if we see a repeat, the next couple of cycles of that kind of sentiment, if you're a Republican politician, you're going to start listening to that and say, my voters say we're doing too much. So I think that kind of attitude bears watching.
Thank you, Bruce. We're almost out of time, but I will turn to each of you for a final, very short comment. I like to end with one key question, but I'm not going to ask if 2024 is going to be Biden versus Trump. I think I'm going to ask, what is the demographic you're mostly looking at in this midterm that you think will turn up more, for example, or vote in an interesting manner? So maybe we'll end up with your quick response to that comment, but I'll start with Mark, because I know you already had raised your hand, Mark. You wanted to make an additional comment. So for your additional comment, and then which demographic are you looking at?
I think everyone's watching suburban women, for one thing, because of that issue is the questions you think normally this would be something that would drive on the abortion issue, but crime and the cost of living have overwhelmingly driven that. So it may have longer term changes. Also remember that in those areas, the formerly Republican educated woman vote is being replaced by the formerly Democratic Hispanic working class vote, which the Hispanic people as a rule tend to be more pro-life anyway. So it's especially in the border states where they're going to be impacting the election. So watching suburban women, I'm also watching Hispanic Americans and how they vote.
Thank you. Bruce? You're muted.
I think I'm sorry. I'm going to answer the question that you wanted to ask, which was basically, I think it will be Biden versus Trump. Biden has said multiple times now, his wife has said that he's running. We have to take him at his word until that changes. Polls show a majority of Democrats don't want him to run. But I think he believes that I got into the race in part because I thought I was the only one who could beat Trump in 2020, and he was right. And I think that he believes that still. The polls tend to show that. And frankly, the Democratic Party is in real trouble if he doesn't run, because it's not clear who would they nominate who could have a chance of beating Trump. And I think Trump will run.
Thank you. And Sarah, finally, your last word and concluding remark.
Two quick things. On the question of Ukraine that Bruce spoke to, I think if you look at some of Tucker Carlson's comments right after Hurricane Ian about aid, you can sort of see the direction of, again, that activist wing of the Republican Party that I was talking about that is now becoming more and more mainstream. It was along the lines of, well, if you were to hang up a Ukraine flag, then aid would come to you faster in Florida. So I think, again, that's a little bit of that activist wing sentiment. I respectfully disagree with Bruce, but I also think that the Republican Party would do itself a favor and not run Trump. And they might be more successful if they didn't run Trump in 2024. And I will plus and Mark in saying that I am most looking at the Hispanic vote this election cycle. And I, for personal reasons and otherwise, I'm very interested in just the way women vote and how they come out and how abortion does play into the conversation, because I do believe it's an economic issue as well.
Thank you very much. I second that, if I may say so, as part of that same demographic. Mark, we are out of time. I'm very sorry. Okay, one word I will allow, but one word.
It will be California Governor Newsom against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in 2024. You heard it here first.
Well, thank you for that. I promise we will be hosting more events in the United States until that time. So I'm sure we'll have you back with us for that and more conversations. It remains to me to thank you very much. This was extremely informative, helpful. I think you've broadened the range of issues that we're looking at, and we all have our eyes on November 8th at the moment. Thank you very much for being such consistently EPRS partners and friends and being online with us today. And for the audience, thank you for being with us. And a reminder that tomorrow at 1:30, we will have another roundtable on Xi Jinping's third term, which is not unrelated, as the range of questions that we've received on China today has shown. So I invite you all to join us. And I thank you very much on behalf of Etienne Bassot as well, and wish you a very nice afternoon. So thank you very much.